sponsored by Instabug, who have an SDK to help you minimize debugging time by providing you with complete device details, network logs, and reproduction steps with every bug report. Find out more at instabug.com. Hello, my name is Paul, and in this video, I want to walk you through what I think it takes to be an iOS developer in 2021. Now, I'm aiming this squarely at two kinds of people. The first is absolute beginners, folks who have never learned Swift or building iOS apps before at all. The second type is so-called false beginners, folks who've tried to learn Swift in the past but never really reached their goal of having that junior level job, that first entry level job in the industry. Now, regardless of what level you are right now, the goal here is the same: to get you in the right position so you can apply for those junior entry level jobs, your first rung on the ladder of iOS development. Now, we're going to talk about the skills you should be learning, the courses you can take, how to get connected to the community, common mistakes folks make, and much more. And most importantly, everything I'll cover in this video is completely free. You haven't got to spend a penny to follow along. Now, seriously, too many folks imagine that spending a ton of money is the fast track to reaching their dream job, when really you only need willpower and determination. That's it. Here's a hint for you. If you're already thinking, I should skip ahead in this video, maybe you want to work on your willpower slightly more. Now, there are 7 sections to this video. The first one is core skills you absolutely have to learn to get a job. The second one is extension skills that will help set you apart from the pack when it comes to applying for your job. The third one is common mistakes folks make when they're learning. The fourth one is resources you can use to learn Swift and more that are completely free. The fifth one is how you can connect to the iOS development community and make friends and network that way. The sixth one is an idea of how long it'll take to reach your goals. And the seventh one is preparing to apply for that first job. Okay, let's get into it. What are the core skills you need to be an iOS developer? Now, this is the absolute minimum skill set I think you need to get started. I think really there are 5 things in total: Swift, Swift UI, working with data, networking, and version control. Those are the 5 things, and that list is super short intentionally for a number of reasons. First, the more you learn, the more you realize there is to learn. So it's easy to spend so much time studying and practicing that you lose sight of the actual goal. You, I hope, want to get a job as an actual iOS developer, not to sit around learning new things, as much fun as that might be. Second, it's almost certain you'll be joining a team that already has an existing app. They want you to help develop that app. So unless you get extremely lucky, they'll have to teach you a whole bunch of new things regardless. So if you try and cram all that stuff in beforehand, there's a good chance you're just wasting your time. They don't need the skills you learned. Third, 2 of those 5 things, my core skills, are really complex. And you can spend months just trying to wrap your head around them without even venturing anywhere else. And the fourth reason that the shortlist is, most importantly, if you get those 5 basic things right, you can build a huge range of apps already. Sure, your code's not going to be perfect, but that's okay. The only way to write great code is to write a whole bunch of bad code first. Okay, let's break those 5 things down into smaller chunks. First on the list is Swift. This is the core programming language from Apple. It has no concept of showing information on an iPhone screen or downloading data from the internet, or just language like JavaScript or Python and more. Use it to create variables, write functions, and so on. It's just pure code. Swift is only a few years old, which means it uses almost every cutting-edge language feature out there. On the one hand, this means you can avoid all the crusty old behaviors that are so common in very old languages like C++ and Java, but it also means you get quite a few advanced features that might blow your mind at first. Quite frankly, it's challenging, and that's okay, right? Lots of parts of Swift are relatively straightforward, and some parts will take you longer to learn. That's just normal. Take your time and keep at it. You will get there. The second core skill I listed was Swift UI, which is a framework from Apple to write apps for iOS, macOS, tvOS, and even watchOS, all using Swift, the language. So while Swift is a programming language, Swift UI provides the tools that lets build apps using that language. How to show pictures, how to write text, how to make clickable buttons or text boxes or tables of data, and more. So just to be clear, SwiftUI isn't somehow a replacement for Swift. It's a framework built on top of Swift that lets us make apps. So you need both Swift and SwiftUI in order to succeed. Now, if you thought Swift was new, you ain't seen nothing yet. As I record this, SwiftUI isn't even 2 years old. But despite being so new, the iOS community has really embraced it wholeheartedly. It's just so much fun to work with. Now, Apple has an older framework for building apps called UIKit. And if you ask a bunch of folks whether you should learn SwiftUI first or UIKit first, you're going to get a whole range of answers. In fact, there's every chance, if you look in the comments below this video, you'll find a bunch of folks telling me I know nothing at all, I don't know what I'm talking about, because UIKit should be a massive priority. So in case you're curious, here's why I think you should focus on SwiftUI as a core skill. First, it is significantly easier than UIKit. And I mean significantly, right? It takes maybe a quarter of the code to get the same results you'd have in UIKit. Sometimes much, much, much less, even more than that. Plus, you have fewer things to learn along the way. This means you get a lot of momentum, you get movement, you get success because you're building things faster. You see your results faster and you iterate on those results faster, which is super motivating when you're learning. Second, SwiftUI was built for Swift, using language features to help you avoid problems and get maximum performance. For example, if you change some data on one screen of an app, SwiftUI will automatically make sure that new data is in anywhere else in your app, will be refreshed automatically. You're going to write code to try and keep it all in sync yourself, which is surprisingly complex. In comparison, UIKit is built for Apple's older language, Objective-C. As a result, has all sorts of quirks and cruft that came about as a result of its age. Third, SwiftUI works on all of Apple's platforms, so you can take what you learn in iOS and use it to build a brilliant macOS app or a watchOS app with almost identical code. Now sure, some things like the digital crown only exist on the Apple Watch, only on one device, but the vast majority of what you learn will work everywhere. But fourth, most importantly, SwiftUI is where things are going. Now if you're applying for a job now, like today, then fine, you probably have to know UIKit. But as you're watching this video, it means you're probably much earlier in the process. Yes, UIKit's more popular today, but by the time you finish learning in 6 months or 9 months or even 12 months from now, SwiftUI will be the dominant UI framework. I have no doubt about that at all. Seriously, the world's biggest companies are choosing SwiftUI, including Apple itself. In fact, Apple, they recently launched widgets in iOS 14 and made it a requirement that you must use SwiftUI in widgets. UIKit is just not possible there. It doesn't work. Now, the third and fourth skills I mentioned were networking and working with data. Now, compared to Swift and SwiftUI, these are a piece of cake, right? Or at least they are at the level you've got to be to get a junior iOS developer job. Networking is the practice of fetching data from the internet, from a server somewhere, or sending data from a local device to a server somewhere. So you either get it or you send it. There are stacks and stacks of ways of doing this, but honestly, the absolute least you have to know is how to fetch some JSON, some data from a server. And that's where the other core skill comes in, working with data. Again, there's a huge range of ways you can load and save and manipulate data, but the absolute least you got to be able to do is convert that data you get from a server using your network code into some kind of thing your app can show. So grab some JSON from a server, grab some data from a server, load it somehow, and show it on the screen. Networking and working with data. These are the skills. So really, the third and fourth skills go hand in hand. Fetch something from a server, convert it to information you can show in your app. Now, some developers joke this kind of code is actually half the job of iOS developers, and it's certainly true. We use these skills a lot. Hello, dogs. How are you doing? Now, the last skill isn't really coding at all. It is version control. So I'll just give my dog a treat. Come on, you. Come on, up. It's version control, which is using something like Git. Good girl. Again, you don't have to know much here. Just like networking, right? But it's important you put your code somewhere. You publish your code somewhere, like GitHub, so recruiters, interviewers can see your code publicly. Come on, up here. Come on. Honestly, genuinely, I don't think anyone in the world, even the Git maintainers who write Git, truly understand how all of Git works. They just don't. And that's okay. You just need to know enough of the basics to store data safely, to put your code somewhere, and to work alongside others. That's it. Nothing more than that. So putting those 5 together, there are 2 massive ones, Swift and SwiftUI, plus 3 smaller but still important ones. And honestly, if you can just focus on those 5 things without getting distracted, you'll make massive strides towards your first iOS developer job. And that's it. Those are the 5 core skills I think you need to be an iOS developer. There are thousands of folks out there who only have those skills and can build and ship fantastic apps on the App Store. But what comes next? What comes after those core skills? So once you've already gotten grips with those 5 core skills, you are absolutely 100% in a position to ship your own apps and work as an indie developer. And also in a position to apply for jobs, junior, entry-level jobs that will work for a company. There are no special qualifications you need. Get those 5 core skills down, you're in a good place. But if you've worked your way through those 5 and you want to go further, there are 5 extension skills I would encourage you to consider learning. These are skills that will take you from your good place up to being in a great place. You'll be even more employable, and the range of apps you'll be able to build will grow even further. The 5 extension skills I believe you need are 1. UIKit, 2. Core data, 3. Testing, 4. Software architecture, and 5. Multi-threading. As before, I want to explain those in a bit more detail so you can understand why I think they're important and why I consider them extension skills and not core skills. First, UIKit. Like I said, this is Apple's older UI framework, and it's been used for building apps since 2008, right? It's 13 years old as I'm recording this, which in software terms is old, right? It's almost ancient. But that doesn't mean UIKit is bad. And in fact, as you become comfortable with UIKit, the way it works, which takes some time, I agree, you'll be surprised at how elegant it is. Now, there are lots of things that make UIKit worth learning, including the fact that hundreds of thousands of apps have already been written in UIKit. And so if you're joining a company with a large, well-established app out there, you will almost certainly have to write some UIKit code to maintain that code. Second up, UIKit is significantly more powerful than SwiftUI. There are some things, many things you can do in fact, in UIKit that are not possible in SwiftUI at this time. WWDC 21, probably a few months away now, I expect it will change. But right now, UIKit can do many things SwiftUI cannot. Third up, you can create extraordinarily precise layouts using a technology called auto layout from UIKit. And fourth, if you hit problems in your code, there are simply more solutions in UIKit than in SwiftUI, simply because it's been around longer. It's been around since 2008. It's old, so lots of questions and answers have been posted already for you to learn from. Now, you might think all that makes UIKit sound great. So why is it an extension skill? Why is it not a core skill? Well, because UIKit has problems too. First, almost everything is harder to do in UIKit than SwiftUI. It just is. Some things will take you literally 100 times as much code to do in UIKit than in Swift, if not more. I mean, it's a lot. SwiftUI is made specifically for modern iOS development to make it as easy and convenient as possible. So it does vast amounts of work for you. Second, because UIKit wasn't written for Swift, you'll find it has all sorts of features that you forget about. You haven't got to worry about with SwiftUI. Lots of implicitly unwrapped optionals. Lots of marking code with a special @obj_c attribute to make it available to UIKit's Objective-C underbelly. Lots of having to use protocols and delegates to show simple data. And fourth, nothing about auto layout is auto. In fact, if you ever do have to try and build a complex layout, there's a good chance you'll have nightmares about auto layout. It's extremely clever, but it's also extremely hard in places. And that's why I consider UIKit to be an extension skill. It takes significantly more time and effort to learn compared to SwiftUI, which in turn means it takes a great deal more determination. You've got to really want to learn it, to fight to learn it, otherwise you'll be confused, bored, angry, or potentially all three at the same time. So yeah, SwiftUI has not got all the features of UIKit, but at least you make quick progress. You feel a sense of momentum and success before you go on to move on to UIKit later on. The second extension skill I talked about was Core Data, which is Apple's framework for storing application data. Now, in the core skills section, I listed both networking and working with data, and it's true. With those skills, you can fetch something from a server and show it in your app. What Core Data does is go a step further. It lets you manipulate that once you have it. For example, searching for particular values or sorting the results and more. All very efficiently. It also links up to iCloud, so you can get users' data synchronized across all their devices very easily. Now, Core Data has a whole bunch of downsides, which the biggest one being it's just not very pleasant to work with. Core Data is about as old as UIKit. And although it worked great with Objective-C, it just does not feel comfortable in Swift. It does have good integration with SwiftUI, which makes it feel a bit less strange, but it's still a surprisingly complex topic. So, why do I consider it an extension skill? Because like UIKit, Core Data has been extremely popular. Hundreds of thousands of apps out there have been built using Core Data, and it's used in many companies, large and small. Also like UIKit, Core Data is really powerful. Although you can recreate most important parts by hand if you want to, why would you want to? The third skill on my extension skills list is testing. Writing special code that tests your main application code works the way you expect it to work, the way it should work. Now, tests allow us to be sure our code works correctly, and more importantly, make sure it continues to work correctly after we've made significant changes to it. If you change 500 lines of code over here to add a new feature, and all your tests still pass, you're good to go. So, testing is important, and it will help you write better quality software. So why then is it an extension skill and not a core skill? Well, there are three reasons. First up, for whatever historical reasons, the iOS community as a whole is just bad at testing. I mean, really, really bad at testing. Many apps, big apps, have hardly any tests at all. And I've lost track of how many senior iOS developers I've met who are almost proud they never write tests. I don't understand it either. I don't get it. It's just weird, okay? Second up, when you think of all the remarkable things you can build with Apple's tools and frameworks, honestly, it just doesn't seem much fun to write tests in comparison. Now, I personally enjoy writing tests in the same way I enjoy flossing my teeth, but I know many people just don't find them exciting, particularly on personal projects. The third thing, when you're applying for a job, having knowledge of Swift and Apple's major frameworks like SwiftUI and UIKit will always be more beneficial than about writing tests. Companies would much rather you know how to use SwiftUI or UIKit or one of the other big hitters, because in comparison, testing is a significantly smaller topic. There aren't nearly as many things to learn there. So, testing is important. Testing absolutely matters, and I would love you to grasp how to write unit tests really well. But do it after you've grasped the basics of building apps. Get some success under your belt. Feel the sheer excitement of having your app on the App Store, live for millions of users, and then get to grips with testing. That's my advice. The fourth extension skill I want to talk about is software architecture, which really is about the way we write our code. Now, when you're just learning, you're going to write, frankly, terrible code. Code so bad it probably breaks the Geneva Convention, and that's okay, because that's how you learn. You don't just start good, you get good by being bad for a very long time. Just as LeBron James wasn't born a champion basketball player, born with no idea of basketball, and then learns and gets great over time. The point is, you persevere with your bad code until you learn to do better. And that's where software architecture comes in. These are proven techniques for structuring your code to make it easier to read, easier to use, easier to modify, easier to take care of in the longer term. And sometimes these techniques rely on the way Swift works. Language features to help you write better code. But there are many other techniques that work in any programming language, and we call these design patterns. Now, one major point you should start to learn about as part of this skill is how you break up your code. For example, if you're building one screen in your app, you might have a login button, an image gallery, and a list of friends all on this one screen. But ideally, you make each of these parts separate components. A login button component, an image gallery component, a friends list component, so you can reuse these components in other parts of your app as you need to. Now, software architecture is much more subjective than the other skills I've mentioned so far. For the others, you can say, well, I know how to do X, Y, and Z in SwiftUI, so I feel confident I'm a good SwiftUI developer. Software architecture is a very broad topic, and honestly, a lot of it is not that objective. There's no obvious right way to solve a problem. I think the best benchmark for it is this. If you look back on your code from 6 months ago, or a year ago, or 3 years ago, and so on, do you think, wow, that code is bad? Again, writing bad code is okay, as long as it's putting you on the track to writing better code. I certainly look back on code I wrote 5 years ago and just grimace in places, because I know way more now than I did back then. And that's good. That's normal. The fifth and final extension skill I want to talk about is multi-threading, which in simple terms is the practice of making your code do more than one thing at a time. Now, multi-threading can be a real headache to work with because it's just hard for our brains to understand. When your code does one thing at a time, we can think it through linearly. But when 2 or 3 things happen at the same time, potentially overlapping each other, it can really bend your brain. So although multi-threading is a great thing to have as an extension skill, you got to be careful. Your goal ought to be to understand just enough of the concepts and the code to make it work well, without going a great deal further. Honestly, a lot of developers think multi-threading will make their code run 3 or 4 times faster immediately. And in some cases, it will. But in many other cases, your code will actually run slower. And now you have all the additional complexity to deal with in your head. If you don't believe me, check out this quote from David Smith. He's one of the Swift team at Apple and previously spent years working on the very core of Apple's frameworks. He said, "My concrete recommendation is this. You should really strongly consider not writing asynchronous/concurrent code. I know it sounds weird in 2018, but the cost in complexity and performance is high." So, learn a little of how multi-threading works in Swift, just so you can see the concepts and implementation, but try not to go overboard. Now at this point, I've outlined all the core and extension skills I think you need in order to work as a full-time iOS developer. But I also want to talk about some of the most common mistakes folks make while learning, because I see these a lot, and I know it just sets people back. Just to give you an idea, my site Teaching Folks Swift has over 700,000 unique visitors every month. So we have over 5 million page views a month. So I feel pretty comfortable in saying I know the common mistakes folks hit. There are 7 in total, I think, and I want to cover them in order. They are memorizing everything, shiny object syndrome, lone wolf learning, using beta software, relying on Apple's documentation, getting lost in Objective-C, and taking shots at other languages. Let's walk through each of those individually. The first, and by far the most common problem folks hit, is trying to memorize everything. Reading through a tutorial and thinking they must remember everything in there by heart. Please, please, please do not do that. It's a recipe for disaster. It will suck all your willpower out of you until you never want to program again. No one memorizes everything. No one even comes close to memorizing everything. I don't come close to doing it. Nowhere near close. Even if you just think about the APIs Apple publishes, which is the pieces of code we use to build our apps. There must be well over 100,000 of them out there. If you restrict that to just the core components of app building, there's probably still several hundred, if not well over 1,000, all working in a very precise way that requires a lot of learning to utilize. Instead, what happens is you learn how to do something new, then promptly forget it. So you look it up and use it again, then promptly forget it again. So you look it up a third time and you use it, and this time you mostly forget it. Some parts do stick in your brain just through sheer bashing it in there eventually, right? This repeats again and again, each time you have to refer to a tutorial or some other reference guide to remember how to do it, until eventually the really core things have stuck in your head to the point where you can do it without referring elsewhere. Oh, hello. It's my other dog wants a treat now, sorry. Come on then. The one for you. Come on you, good job, move. Other dog. 2 dogs. Come on, up. Come on, get up here. Well done. Good girl. Okay. And what's happening here is you're learning through repetition, right? If you weren't already aware, forgetting is a core component of learning. Because each time you forget something and then relearn it, it goes into your brain a bit deeper and you learn it a bit more thoroughly. And each time you relearn, your brain makes new connections, right? It's with other things you've learned come together. It's like drawing the dots together to make it understand more of the context of what you're trying to do. And each time you relearn, you're making it clear to your brain, this topic matters. This is worth stashing away in my long-term memory. But if you set out trying to memorize everything from the start, you're going to have a hard time. Instead, don't worry about forgetting things. Much more important is knowing where to look. And rather than trying to memorize specific Swift code, just think, oh, here's where I learned how to do tables. Here's where I learned buttons, images, So you know where to go and learn them again if you need to. And when you forget something and you got to relearn it, I want you to think of that as being a good thing, right? That information will sink in deeper the second time, the third time, the 10th time you learn it. So you're doing your brain a favor. It'll be better that way. The second most common problem I see folks hit is what I call shiny object syndrome. They find a tutorial series that works well for them and they start making some progress, but after a week or two, they find some other series they want to follow and jump ship there instead. I had folks email me saying they've tried 4, 5, or even 6 different tutorial series and are, for some weird reason, finding they aren't learning anything. The problem here usually is that large parts of learning anything, not just coding, learning anything, aren't exciting. And that's not the fault of the teacher or the course necessarily, it's just a fact of learning to code. Some things give you great results with hardly any work, and other things take a lot more time to understand, don't yield fancy results, or just one part of a larger concept. So when you hit these steep learning curves, shiny object syndrome becomes powerful. With so many free tutorials out there, you can jump ship to any one of them and be back in the shallow part of the pool again, the easier thing you've already learned about. But unless the original course chose a particularly weird topic to cover, you're going to have to learn it eventually. You're just kind of delaying the inevitable. So I'm not asking you to always resist shiny object syndrome, because I know it's hard. Instead, at least be conscious of it. When you hit a problem, try asking someone for help and powering through your current course rather than switching. Speaking of asking someone else, the third problem I see folks hit is when they go all lone wolf with their learning. They have it in their mind, they are fully capable of learning to build iOS apps all by themselves and need no help from others. This approach does work well for a very small number of people, and they're usually the ones who have extensive experience with other languages or platforms. But for the overwhelming majority of people, trying to learn like this is a horrible experience. Every mistake or misunderstanding takes 5 times as long to figure out. It's extremely easy to lose motivation this way, and you're missing out on a whole lot of inspiration from seeing what others are doing. If you are naturally into this lone wolf style of learning, let me encourage you now to change. Share what you're learning. Find others who are learning. Get into the habit of asking questions to them and more. Not only will you discover there's a fantastic community of learners out there who will surround you with support and encouragement and motivation, but you'll be inspired by their work and in turn inspire them with your work. Trust me, I've seen this hundreds of times and it's utterly transformative. The fourth big problem folks hit when they're learning is they insist on using beta versions of Apple's development tools. And I get it. Every year, Apple adds a new iOS, a new macOS, a new watchOS and more, all with new exciting things for us to try. and it's totally natural for folks to want to have the latest, greatest thing that's out there, particularly if they know that Swift has a long history of changing. However, folks get into all sorts of problems when they try to learn using beta software. Tutorials probably haven't been updated yet for the beta software, so you're following their instructions won't always be possible, or might not work correctly because things have changed in the beta. Betas usually have bugs galore, particularly so for ones for the major iOS releases that happen around June time. The early betas of iOS 15 this year, for example, have bugs galore all over the place. And also, Apple's beta frameworks take time to stabilize, meaning that code that works great in beta 1 might not even exist in beta 3. So, I know it's exciting to learn new stuff, and I realize you might think you're getting ahead of the game with new features, but trust me, it is not worth it. Always stick to the latest, public, stable releases of Apple's developer tools from the Mac App Store, at least until feeling comfortable with them. The fifth big problem I see folks hit when they're trying to learn is relying on Apple's documentation. Now, Apple's developer publications team, DevPubs, they work hard to document as much as they can from the company's vast range of frameworks. But their job, for the most part, is to write reference material, things you read when you're trying to use a particular piece of their tools, rather than trying to create a structured course to help you learn to build iOS apps with a smooth learning curve. Now, I've lost track of the number of times folks told me, how can I learn Swift? Only to be answered by someone else in the community, just read Apple's Swift reference guide. And this approach, again, works for some people. I know that because it worked for me. I read it cover to cover when Swift was first announced. However, for most people, it's a bit like trying to learn a human language by reading a dictionary. It's designed to cover everything in Swift, in the whole language, rather than teach you the most important parts and how to actually apply them. And so if you have an extensive experience with other languages, you might find reading Apple's reference guides useful. But if you're just starting out, then maybe come back to them after a few months. The sixth big problem folks hit is trying to learn Objective-C. This was Apple's primary development language before Swift was introduced. And although you'll find some remnants in some old projects, the overwhelming majority of code out there is now Swift. And almost all new code is also Swift. Now, I spent years writing Objective-C before Swift came along. I really grew to love it. But it's got a shockingly steep learning curve. If you thought Swift was hard, you ain't seen nothing yet. And it also misses out on most of Swift's more advanced features. I remember when I first tried out the iPhone SDK when Apple announced it a long time ago, I was just horrified by Objective-C because it was entirely unlike everything I'd seen before. For a learner, Objective-C and Swift have almost nothing in common. Yes, they both have the same frameworks from Apple mostly, like UIKit. But unless you're actually planning to work at Apple, which is the only company in the world still producing large amounts of Objective-C, then you should leave Objective-C well alone and focus entirely on Swift. And the final major mistake I see folks hit when they're learning Swift is to dump on other languages as if they were somehow inferior to Swift. The usual target is JavaScript, but you'll also see folks take shots at Python, Java, Ruby, Go, and more. And for what? It's not a competition, folks. Those languages haven't got to lose in order for Swift to win. That's not how it works. In fact, Swift and SwiftUI regularly and literally and publicly take inspiration from other languages and frameworks. Whenever a new language features are considered, they look around. How is it done in Rust? How is it done in Python? How is it done in Haskell and other languages? And SwiftUI itself is hugely inspired by the React framework in JavaScript. So when I see folks in our community say, SwiftUI is JavaScript free or similar, I just cringe. Nothing could be further from the truth. And now for the part most folks will care about. What are the actual resources I think you can use to learn Swift and SwiftUI and more to actually reach your goal of being an iOS developer? There are lots of them out there. Bluntly, there's a huge amount out there, and I really appreciate the fact that the community is so big to have a broad range of perspectives from different people sharing their experience. However, here I'm specifically going to look at resources that are free, places you can go and learn to build fantastic apps without paying a cent. And there are two reasons for this. First, some folks believe that the more a Swift course costs, the better it must be. So you end up paying eye-watering prices, over $100 or $200, without getting enough benefit from that. And second, many sites like Udemy rely on selling lots of low-priced courses, confident if you don't like one course, you'll just buy a different one. They also have got a business model similar to Steam's. There are sales running all the time, encouraging folks to build up a huge library of courses they'll study one day, but never really get around to. But it feels good buying them. They like to learn something just by buying them, and you haven't. You can actually read the course and go through it and learn that way. So I'm only going to list resources here that are free. So I don't want you to fall into one of those traps. Don't splash out $100 or more on your first course. Don't buy a dozen cheap courses if you think that makes you a developer. It doesn't. First up, Apple has two major resources that will help you. The first is its Teaching Code site, which lists student and teacher resources for learning Swift from the absolute basics up to professional certifications. The curriculum is massive, so it might take you a little bit of time to figure out the best entry point for you, where you should go in at. However, once you're there, you'll find lots of things to explore. And second, Apple's got a whole series of Swift UI tutorials that walk you through building real apps. These do not teach you Swift though. That means you have to follow the Swift-focused curriculum first and then go on to Swift UI stuff. Like I said earlier, Apple also makes a guide specifically for the Swift programming language, but there's a very good chance it will not work for you. It's designed to be a reference rather than a structured tutorial, so it's quite dense reading. What Apple's tutorials don't do is try and provide a structured way to learn. That's where my own free tutorials come in. I have hundreds of articles and videos about Swift, Swift UI, UIKit, and more. But there are two in particular I want to recommend to you. The 100 Days of Swift UI and the 100 Days of Swift. So the 100 Days of Swift UI course takes you through learning the fundamentals of Swift using articles, videos, and interactive tests. Then walks you through building over 20 real-world apps using Swift UI. Again, all with articles and videos and tests to make sure what you're learning is sinking in. Each tutorial builds on what you already learned, so the learning curve is nice and gradual. As you can guess from the title, the whole thing lasts just 100 days, a little over 3 months. If you'd rather learn UIKit than Swift UI, that's where the original 100 Days of Swift comes in. It's a similar idea, but built using UIKit rather than Swift UI for folks who prefer that path. Now there are also some fantastic YouTube tutorials walking you through the fundamentals of Swift UI, including one from Chris Ching where he walks you through building a slot machine game from scratch, or one from Mark Moykins where he explains 5 Swift UI concepts everyone should learn when they start programming. And there's one from me where I teach both Swift and Swift UI at the same time while also answering questions from a live audience. Now, although they aren't quite so structured, there are other sites that have high quality Swift and Swift UI tutorials, including Blackbirds, Ray Wenderlich, Donny Valls, Antoine van der Ley, and much more. And I really encourage folks to visit a range of resources and find what works for them. Now, if you prefer to learn using apps, there are two I recommend, both again completely free. The first is Apple's Swift Playgrounds app, which lets you learn Swift right on your iPad or your Mac. There are lots of interactive lessons aimed at kids, but there are some more advanced lessons that will help you push your skills further. The other app's one I make myself is called Unwrap. It works on all iPhones and iPads and lets you learn, review, and practice the fundamentals of Swift using videos, tests, and more. And it covers all the fundamentals of Swift, and it works great alongside the 100 Days of Swift UI curriculum. Finally, at some point, you have to learn to find answers online. This might mean going to Stack Overflow, but honestly, I hope not, because it's not a terribly pleasant place. Instead, ask questions on the Hacking with Swift forums, or your favorite Slack group, or the iOS Dev Happy Hour sessions, or on Twitter and more. We are genuinely a very warm, welcoming community with a lot of folks willing to help you reach your goals. Speaking of our community, I want to turn to a really important topic that will help you meet folks in a similar position to you, and help you learn more effectively, and help you find a job opening too. It's just a win-win-win all around. The topic is this: connecting to the iOS development community. This means learning where to look for news and interesting ideas, where to go when you want to ask folks questions or share tips, and helpful places you can go to meet folks. Let's start with the easiest one first, which is using Twitter. Twitter is a really fantastic way to follow things that interest you. In the case of iOS development, there are a handful of folks I would really recommend. And these people tweet about their own work. Yes, of course they do. But the reason I think they're great to follow on Twitter is because they also tweet a lot of other people's work too. They help you see a range of perspectives on a particular topic and share all sorts of interesting ideas and things to try. There are 10 folks I'd recommend following on Twitter in no particular order. First is Sean Allen. Now, Sean spends a lot of his time making YouTube videos about Swift and iOS development. But he also works super hard to spread the news about things other people have made. He does a really good job of helping everyone discover something new every week. Second is Antoine van der Leij. He runs a website just for iOS development at avanderleij.com, but he also shares some great links to useful resources he finds on GitHub, newsletters, and more. Third is Naval Khan. Now, she works at Apple, but that doesn't stop her ever from making regular videos about things she's working on, what she's learning, what she has trouble with, and more. She's really inspiring. Fourth is Steve Troughton-Smith. Now, he's well known for his earlier work poking around in the back ends of iOS, but really you should follow him for the fantastic range of links he shares to really impressive work. I personally like the way he shares his own development progress on his own apps, so you can see them grow from start to finish, from almost nothing to shipping in the App Store. And number 5 is Kaya Thomas. She's one of the most famous indie developers in our community, I think. She's been featured by Apple more times than I can remember. She tweets a lot about her own work and presentations, but also shares links to books she's reading or books she's learning from or articles she's read and more, which is really helpful. Number 6 is Majid Jabrailov. He writes a fantastic blog about Swift and SwiftUI, but he's also a tireless promoter of others. And if you follow him on Twitter, you'll get a idea after idea sent your way from a huge range of sources. Number 7, Donny Valls. He writes a Swift blog, as well as more recently books on Combine and Core Data. But on Twitter, he also encourages folks to share what they're working on. And even just reading that one thread every week will get you stoked with things to try. So just definitely follow Donny. Number 8 is Summer Panage, who works on Apple helping folks make their apps more accessible. So she's already restricted somewhat by what she can say, but she does tweet out some first-class tips from herself and others that everyone can use to build better apps. Number 9, Natasha Fadiva. She writes a blog about Swift and iOS development, including articles on core data, interview questions, and more. But she also tweets about things she's found elsewhere. And finally, there's me. I tweet a lot about all things I'm working on with Swift, SwiftUI, and more, but also try and share great articles, videos, and apps that others have made. I think it's one of the most important things I do, and everyone on this list does for the community. Now, of course, Twitter is not the only place where you can keep up with the community. There are newsletters, there's Slack groups, there's Zoom meetups, forums, conferences, and more. I don't want to bore you too much, so I'm going to list one of each of those as a sample to get you going. For newsletters, you can't go wrong with iOS Dev Weekly. As I record this, it just passed 500 issues, one every week. So that tells you immediately all you have to know about how important it is. Second up, if you'd like to post in the web forum, I host one myself at hackingwithswift.com/forums. There are lots of categories to choose from, and everyone is welcome to take part, regardless of your experience level. Trust me, you are more than welcome to post your beginner questions there, with no judgmental responses. Third up, every month, iOS Dev Happy Hour takes place on a group Zoom call with over 300 people. I know it sounds busy, but the real fun here is the breakout rooms, where you can chat with groups of 6 to 8 people at a time. It's a lot of fun, and you will make friends there. Next up, attending conferences. It's been tricky thanks to the coronavirus pandemic, but Apple's WWDC was a huge hit last year, and also has a wide variety of community events taking place alongside. Now, a group of friends and I ran a GitHub repository to help list all the other events and articles and more that happened, so check out the link you can see on screen right here. And finally, if you want to chat on Slack where you can get answers more quickly, you can join the free Hacking with Swift Slack group. It's just hackingwithswift.com/Slack. Then join one of the channels that interests you, where it's iOS, SwiftUI, 100 days curriculums or more. There's a channel for you. Now, I want to move on to an important question, a slightly more difficult question, but one I get asked a lot. How long does it take to go from knowing nothing about Swift to being able to get an entry-level iOS developer position? Now, obviously, the immediate answer is, it depends, but that'd be a huge cop-out here, so I'm going to try and address it in a few different ways. First, what you cannot do is rush through several courses at the same time. Remember what I said about shiny object syndrome? Yeah, that. Many people really do think they can do 2 courses at the same time, or 3 at the same time, and then rush through 3, 4, 5 hours every day and still end up somehow with a high quality understanding of topics that were covered. To be clear, I have seen folks try that so many times and it fails every time. Every single time. It never works. And I see folks say tutorials were bad, Swift was too hard, or literally any other reason than them trying to rush through something complex. Literally just today, I received an email saying, "Hi Paul, if I spend 4 or 5 hours a day learning Swift, how fast can I finish?" And that's just not how learning works. Not learning Swift, not learning to play the piano, not learning to ice skate or whatever. You wouldn't say, if I play piano 5 hours a day, will I be a professional pianist in 3 months? No, you won't. That's not how it works. Learning Swift is hard in places. Learning to build apps takes a lot of trial and error, a lot of making mistakes, a lot of wrong turns, and that's all okay. It's better than okay. It's great. Each time you try something, each time you make a mistake, each time you make a wrong turn, you will learn something along the way. And when you finally come to the solution, you'll understand it in much more depth. So the TLDR, too long didn't read here, is don't try and rush. Take your time. Don't be afraid to explore tangents in your code that come along. Don't be afraid to experiment with your projects. Don't be afraid to go back to something you learned previously and relearn it as needed. Second, you should take into account what kind of background you have before you came to Swift. You see, learning to build apps takes a wide variety of skills. And if you're coming to the table with lots of existing knowledge, such as version control, data structures, algorithms, and more, then you've got a real head start compared to folks who are coming new to computing science in general, alongside coming fresh to Swift and other Apple frameworks. So we can kind of imagine a few different places you might be right now in your life. If you've got a computing science degree, you already have covered many core CS fundamentals to get moving with Swift. Things like variables, strings, loops, arrays, sets, functions, OOP, and more will all prove useful in Swift, as well as all your work with data structures and algorithms. And I think this is going to shave 4 to 6 months off your learning path, depending on what subjects you studied at school, in that part of the degree or whatever, but it'll also give you an advantage when applying for a job at many companies that require a CS degree. Second, if you don't have a CS degree, but did go to a coding bootcamp, again, you'll have many of the fundamentals you have to need for Swift. This will not give you the same advantage of having a degree. For some companies that require these things, they have a check on the list of arbitrary requirements missing, but it'll still shave 3 or maybe 4 months off your learning path. If you don't have a CS degree and did not attend a bootcamp, but you have been doing coding in your spare time in any language, again, that will shave off time on your learning path. Probably 2 months or so, depending on what language or frameworks you're using. And what if you have no CS degree, no bootcamp, and no prior coding experience? Then I'd say you're looking at sort of 9 to 12 months, going from nothing to an entry-level job. And yes, that is potentially a full year working alongside whatever is your full-time job. And that's just to get your first job as an iOS developer. Is it always a year? No, of course it's not. Like I said, you can shave 1 to 6 months off that, depending on your prior experience. And if you kind of take the best numbers on both sides, like 9 months from nothing to a job, plus having 6 months off having a CS degree, that potentially means you could be hireable in just 3 months, which is remarkable, quite frankly. Now you might think, no, that's not possible. You cannot get your first job in 3 months. It is entirely possible. I have met someone in person who was following my 100 Days of Swift course who was offered a job before they even reached day 50. They'd already learned enough about app development and Swift and UIKit at the time to get going and get a job, because they put the work in to make every day count. So, you do not need a CS degree. You haven't got to go to a boot camp, but you do have to be prepared to work hard. The third thing I want to address before we move on is to say it's going to take as long as it takes, right? John Lennon has a fantastic lyric that I love, which is, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. And it is fantastic. I love it when I see folks have grand plans for learning and big aspirations for the dream job they want to have, but sometimes you're tired. Sometimes you're stressed out. Sometimes your roof starts leaking, your dog gets sick, or you've got to help your kid with the homework more than usual, or whatever. And that's just life. Life happens. So don't beat yourself up if you fall behind with this amazing learning schedule that you have, or you find yourself missing a few days, or even a few weeks, and so on. As long as you are resilient, it's that determination and willpower thing again, you will get there. So if you work super hard and get a job after 50 days of one of my courses, fantastic, well done. If it takes you 500 days, that's also fantastic. You should be just as proud. Heck, if it takes you 5 years, I know it's not what you wanted, but the end result is the same. And you still have like another 40 years to work as a developer. That's what matters. So, last but not least, if you're a little further into your iOS learning path and you're starting to think about getting that first entry-level job, I want to point you to a massive collection of resources I assembled to help you, all free. On my site, you can go to careers, then start here, or just visit hackingwithswift.com/career-guide directly. There you'll find an epic collection of resources that will help you no matter where you are, all of which are completely free, including interactive skill reviews to test your knowledge of core topics, coding tests that are used around the world in real job interviews, over 200 commonly used interview questions along with suggestions for ways you can answer them, plus articles on how to find jobs, how to do your best at interviews, and more. Just go to the URL and you'll find links to all that and more in one place. I also want to point you towards Sean Allen's collection of videos full of Swift interview tips. He's got a whole playlist for them. I'll link it in the description below, where you can work through discussions such as classes versus structs, or functional programming, or error handling, and more. None of the videos are long, but each one's aimed at giving you just the skills you need to perform well on that topic in an interview scenario. Okay, so I've gone through the core and extension skills you want to learn. I've also gone through common mistakes folks make when learning, what courses you can follow, how to connect to the iOS community, and how to prepare for your iOS job interview. There's a huge amount to get through, and I hope it's been useful. What's more, I hope I've shown you how much is out there that's completely free. And again, yes, I know the temptation is super strong to splash out $100 or more for a course. Please relax. Get moving first. Find some momentum first, and also find someone who teaches Swift in a way that works for you. And then, when you're in a good place and you feel ready, fine. Go ahead and spend money if you want to. And if you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel. I make lots more videos like this one teaching you Swift, Swift UI, UIKit, and more, all completely free. And if you have ideas for things you consider essential skills or core skills or more, comment below. Let folks know. I'd love to hear them.